Master your money, free your future. Welcome to Budget for Life. My name's Jeremy. I'm not a professional YouTuber. I'm a financial advisor, but this video is not financial advice. In this video, I want to show you some awesome insights that we can glean as it relates to GameStop's gross margins in a line that they have never told us specifically their gross margins before. And I'll show you how we can come to that conclusion. And it's a key building block for understanding in the present day GameStop business how much of their hardware business is coming from used versus new sales, and how much of their software business is coming from used versus new sales, which is important to know for several reasons. But most importantly, of course, is modeling and understanding their financials and getting a better look of how do they get the margins that they get. I know you can't actually see this screen yet. I'll zoom in a minute. But man, what a beautiful spreadsheet, guys. Just love this thing. Um, okay, so what do I want to talk about today? Well, GameStop changed their accounting several times, and for a while, they simply listed new hardware, new software, pre-owned, and then other. And in 2013, they began breaking out other into accessories, right? They made accessories its own line, digital its own line. Other, they made PC software and collectibles. But why did they break this out? They broke this out so that they could show you or sell you the mobile and consumer electronics growth story. So they wanted that to be its own line, and you can see in sales they went from 12 million to 200 million to 300 million. But we know that a lot of this happened through acquisition, right? We know they were opening AT&T stores, opening SimplyMac stores, and also that they bought a online buy Mytronics, reseller. So how much of this revenue was coming from actual GameStop stores, right? Was the iPad and mobile business, laptop business boosting GameStop stores or not? Or was it all just external? And then what margins was GameStop getting? Well, we end up finding out because what happens a few years later is that GameStop decides that it also wants to break out collectibles, right? So every year, right, we're seeing this mobile and electronics growth story continue to play out. But in fiscal 2016, they decide to break out collectibles into its own line. Why did they do that? Because look, it's another growth story they're wanting to show you or to sell you, right? From 2014, 75 million, then 300 million, then 500 million. So collectibles are growing quickly, and GameStop wants to show you that growth, and they want to show you the margins that they're getting on that collectibles business. But again, this too, we know that GameStop did not actually generate organically, but they did through acquisition, right? They bought ThinkGeek, they bought a collectibles business that already had collectibles dedicated stores. So even this collectibles line, a lot of that was happening outside of GameStop stores. But here's what happens is the other business goes from PC and collectibles to PC and GameStop's portion of the electronics business. So they net out GameStop's portion of the electronics business from mobile and consumer electronics. And instead, they start reporting tech brands. So mobile and consumer electronics used to be all mobile and consumer electronics, no matter what store they were sold from. When they make this change to highlight tech brands, as a result, they decide to say, we're going to just show AT&T, SimplyMac, Cricut stores as its own line called Tech Brands. And then we're going to move the GameStop electronics business into other. Why are they doing this? Probably to be able to show continued growth in their tech brands and to make the margins on that business look more attractive. But when they do this, they also give us an amazing opportunity to discern the margins on GameStop's electronics business. So if you look on these, I mean, if you're on my spreadsheet, then of course you can find it, which by the way, thank you to the fans and friends of the channel. Thank you to those who have joined the channel. Thank you to the subs. We're trying to get to 2525. Okay, 120 spots left. If you want to be a part of the Halo Sub Club, we'd love for you to be a part of it. Thank you for all the support. All the earnings go to DRS Book Genie shares. We are days away. Maybe today I will finally get my payment for October and we can see how many shares we can lock up together. So far, we have locked up 13 GME shares. I wish this, so I wish this would not keep blipping in and out, but we have 2 years worth of revenue and margins where you can take the difference between the other being collectibles and PC to the other being PC and GameStop electronics to then know how much revenue of this mobile and consumer electronics is actually happening from GameStop. For example, right in 2014, which is the 52 weeks ended in January of 2015, right? You see that the total sales line is the same, 9296. Maybe you can see that, maybe you can't. But this 518 in mobile and consumer electronics, what happens here? Tech Brands is 328 of that. So we know that 518 minus 328 equals GameStop Store's portion of the mobile and consumer electronics business. I'm going to show it to you all put together because we can see the revenue and the margins for these lines in 2015 and in 2014. So on the sales front, right? So it's kind of like a dual, like if you were to take these two numbers together, right? Collectibles and PC equals the 2015 and 14 numbers from their other category as reported at the end of 2015. And then PC and electronics equals the other category as reported at the end of 2016. So again, you'll just have to crunch these numbers yourself if you want to um, dive deeper into it. But there you go, 404, 514. There's the other from 15 and 14, which is their PC and their electronics put together. And then their other from the same years, right? 15 and 14, their other category being collectibles plus software. How do we know this for sure? Because they split out collectibles, right? We know that in 2015 and 2014, collectibles was 309 and 75. So if you take 309 out of that other and you take 75 out of that 416, or sorry, out of 595 and 400, right? 595 minus 309 equals that's how big the PC software business was. 75 out of 45, that's how big the PC software business was. And again, you have all the margins for all of them as well. So you can solve for the revenue, which is super exciting. Oh, wrong chart. Here we go. What do you see here on the revenue front? Okay, leave me alone. Maybe I'm just like not. Oh, you know what I need to do? I just need to make this bigger. Here you go. Here you go, guys. What do you see on the revenue front? One thing you see is that electronics is plummeting in revenue from 2014 to 2015. This is GameStop store electronics. In 2015, this is the profit margins, like the gross margin. So for every $285 of PC software sales that they did in 2015, GameStop earned $88 million of profit for a 31% margin. And they had 18% margins on their electronics business, on the smaller electronic business. But look at 2014, guys. Look at this number that GameStop never wanted you to see. Okay. 190 million, first of all, in revenue was the largest revenue of electronics that GameStop stores ever did. What that 190 in revenue, right, as it relates to a growth story, equated to what? What's 190 divided by 9.3 billion, guys? 190 divided by 9,300. 2%. 2%. Okay, so this was supposed to be the big growth story to save GameStop, right? Was, hey, we're going to start selling mobile, right? And electronics. And how does that growth story pan out? At the peak of the scale, it accounted for 2% of company revenue. And the margins on that 2% of revenue was 9.26%. GameStop was getting crushed in this business in their attempt to scale it. And they actually made more with $70 million less in revenue in 2015. So what do they start to do in 2014? They realized the mobile growth story is not a GameStop store growth story. The mobile and consumer electronics that we're getting from GameStop stores is stinking it up. It can't scale. We try to scale it, it doesn't make a lot of money. So what are we going to do? We're going to move it into other, hide it with PC software. Hopefully no one actually tracks this because GameStop, again, they never reported this gross margin number. They never showed it to you directly, but you can deduce it very simply. Like you can solve for it very simply. Like these are all, I bolded these all because they're all factual. There is no wiggle room here. There's no speculation here. Like these are the real numbers for what GameStop's PC, collectibles, and software businesses, or sorry, and electronics businesses were doing in 15 and 16. So where do they begin to shift? Well, they downsize the electronics business. They say we got to make this a smaller and more highly profitable business. It's not going to be a scale business, but that means we need a new scale story. We need a new growth story, right, to continue to placate investors. So we're going to start reporting collectibles. We're going to make some acquisitions on the collectibles front. So now collectibles is the growth story, and by taking this small and suffering and like marginally insignificant portion of our business, by taking that electronics business out of our tech brands line, we can also make the tech brands story look that much better. Um, this is important. One, it's just interesting, it's fascinating. But once, because of this shift, because of this year, we know that PC software, right, climbing up slightly year over year, that could be coincidental or not, but relatively consistent margins on PC software. And we know that electronics was shrinking dramatically as they resize to a smaller but more profitable electronics business because the scaling GameStop electronics business was a failed story, no doubt. Um, and with this historical margin data, you can then solve for even cooler stuff. Okay. Because in the following years, what happens? Look, they sell their tech brands, right? Tech brands in fiscal 2017, as reported at the end of 2017. But then you have tech brands gone. Why? Because they sold their AT&T stores, which were by far their most profitable business. Very sad to see. How do we know that these are the numbers that AT&T was doing? We know that these are the numbers the AT&T stores were doing. Oh, geez. Because they hadn't yet sold their Cricut and SimplyMac stores. So they had SimplyMac stores, Cricut stores, and AT&T stores. They sell the AT&T stores, but they still have the Cricut and SimplyMac stores, and they lump those in within other. So now other is PC software, GameStop electronics, and tech brands. But then what happens to the Cricut stores and then to the SimplyMac stores? Well, pretty simply, right, we can see how many stores they had in each year to start the year and then to finish the year. And then Cricut is off, totally off the books in 2018. So we know that in 2016 and 2017, these numbers for other are include Cricut plus SimplyMac, but in 2018, they include only SimplyMac. And we know how many stores each of them have. So then you can then solve for, right, what's the total revenue coming from tech brands? And you know that number with certainty because, again, in 2016 and 2017, you had the other category was PC and electronics. But then in 2018, it became PC and electronics and tech brands. But anytime you make a change, you have to make 3 years of historical data, right? So again, you look at this other category as it was reported at the end of 2017, this was 288 and 298. But as it was reported at the end of 2018, the same years were then 414 and 469. What is the difference in those numbers? The difference in those numbers is the Cricut plus SimplyMac stores. So you know that, and they tell you that. Okay, this is all it's all in there. They show you what is the other business, and then they show you the evolution of the other business. Um, so now you know what the PC and tech brands revenue is in 2016 and 17. Or sorry, what the tech brands revenue is, and you know what the margins are. So if you know the revenue and you know the margins and you know the store count between Cricut and SimplyMac, then you can then solve for approximately how much of this is SimplyMac, how much of this is Cricut. So basically, I just gave them proportionally, gosh darn, I need to wrap this video up, guys. If you know that these are the margins in total that they're getting, if you make it make sense with their store count, right? If they're getting a 26% margin in 2016, and it's because they have far more SimplyMac stores, they cut their SimplyMac stores in a third while keeping the same amount of Cricut stores, right? They had the same amount of Cricut stores in 2016 and 2017. So you know that they had a very similar amount of Cricut store revenue. And if they had a similar amount of Cricut store revenue, but they had two-thirds the size of the SimplyMac store, and as a result of the reduction in the SimplyMac portion of the tech brand's revenue, if as a result of that margins go up from 26% to 31%, then you know that Cricut had a much higher margin than the SimplyMac store, but notably a far lower margin than the AT&T stores. And that's because Cricut's probably not selling nearly as much internet and direct TV services, and they're only selling phone plans and phones, and probably even more phones and hardware coming from a Cricut store than from an AT&T store, where often the hardware is lumped into the software. So regardless, you get an idea of what was Cricut doing, what was SimplyMac doing, what were the margins, and you can mess with these numbers, right? Like if you think SimplyMac was only getting 22% in revenue in margins, well, this is their total margin percentage, right? So between the two of these together, you need $45 million of profit. So the less that you think Simply Mac made, the more that therefore that means Cricut made. But again, it's somewhere in this ballpark because historically that's what the electronics business is getting. Um, let's wrap it up there. I'm going to piece it together in a video soon, but with a high clarity of the Cricut and SimplyMac, a high clarity of the historical margins for PC and electronics, as well as the direction of what's happening with those businesses, you can then put together what was PC and electronics looking like in 2016 and 2017. And if you know with a pretty high level of clarity what they were looking like in these years, 16, 17, 18, to match up with these numbers, then you know what portion of the other, right? What portion of this other business, 343 and 414, what portion of that is GameStop likely when they reallocate again to hardware, software, and collectibles? How much of that other is going to hardware? How much of that other is going to software? This is where we landed at. This is the question we were asking a few videos ago, right? The missing pieces to this question, how much of tech brands it was Simply Mac and Cricut, and how much of the rest of other PC and electronics was PC versus electronics? As I made that video, a few hours later, I thought, can we use gross margins to solve for these questions? And it turns out, yes, you can. There's probably a small margin of error here, but minimal. Like this is very close to how other was split in 2018, 17, 16. Why does that matter? Because 2018 and 2017 are the years that also correspond to GameStop's next change, hardware, software, collectibles. So again, we can match up these numbers to these numbers to then get an idea for what portion of the used business, right, the pre-owned business, what portion of that 1800 and then 2100 is hardware versus software, and then what margins is GameStop getting on its pre-owned hardware and pre-owned software. And with those answers, we can then begin to model GameStop's performance, right? We can begin to model their gross margin number with far, far more clarity moving forward, looking at not just hardware, software, collectibles as GameStop reports, but actually being able to re-distill out with pretty good approximation what's hardware, new hardware, what's accessories, right? What's pre-owned hardware, what's new software, what's pre-owned software, what's digital software, and then what's collectibles. And if we can, and we have so much historical data for the gross margins for each of those lines that knowing the trends of those and the margins for those, matching it up with GameStop's current revenue and current margins, we can actually get a lot of information on what constitutes the revenue mix in GameStop today. And then if that's and what we can solve for Q1, for example, and say, well, if these are all the categories and if these are approximately the profit margins they're getting, then what would have changed with Q2 and how do you end up at 2912? Do the assumptions and the equations that you solve for based on Q1, do they carry over quarter to quarter? Do they become accurately prescriptive? Or is it a totally different puzzle, right? With totally different margins, totally different revenue drivers that are impossible to predict. If that's the case, we didn't gain that much. But actually, what ends up being the case is, yeah, you can know a lot more than GameStop's telling you right now. Why does that matter? Well, if you don't care about the fundamentals of the company, then why are you even on this channel? But if you do, then again, it's important because we know that GameStop historically is not prescriptive for GameStop in the future. And if you're bullish on the future prospects of this company, then it's going to help you to know what are those prospects actually looking like and to have as accurate of models as possible. So that's all I got for you today. I hope you appreciate it. I hope you learned something. If you did or didn't, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.